Thank you, John. And good morning, everyone. Welcome to For Grace's 11th annual Women in Pain Conference, the Trauma Pain Connection, a path to recovery and growth. And let me tell you, I and everyone involved with the planning and execution of this conference are really excited about this wonderfully healing day to come. Yay, I'm excited. And now I'm going to get serious. With high impact chronic pain, the question used to be, why me? As in some cosmic inquiry as to the reason for one's suffering. Then at some point it became fashion to ask, why not me? As if anyone could arbitrarily get broadsided by the chronic pain Mack truck. But is that so? I would like to suggest that for the purpose of this conference, we take a deeper dive into the question, why me? Not as victims, but as empowered survivors. Because here today, we will discover the answers. In my never humble opinion, when it comes to chronic pain, trauma is not a piece of the puzzle, it's the entire puzzle. So I'm going to tell you how I put my trauma pain puzzle together and how I then released much of that trauma in order to move forward with my life while helping a bunch of people along the way. Pretty cool, right? And much like our day, I'm going to do this in 3 parts. Now, while this conference is about trauma and pain, with my story, to get to the pain, I have to start with the big C. Part 1, aha. After getting my triple negative breast cancer diagnosis in 2019, the most devastating news of my life, I reached out to my pain doctor for 2 reasons. First, he was the only doctor I trusted, and he was the smartest doctor I knew. After asking him why I had the most aggressive form of breast cancer, something my oncologist and genetic counselor were completely stumped by, he answered quite simply, and I quote, "Cynthia, you've been trying to fix your dysfunctional family your entire life, and the toll that is taken on your body is why you have TNBC." So, wow. As I pondered that, I recollected a conversation I'd had about 7 years prior. At a Women in Pain conference, no less, I was talking with a pain psychologist who keynoted that day. And after I brought up some ongoing family strife, she stated emphatically that chronic pain is the result of childhood trauma. So that blew my hair back. And I started paying close attention to the research articles that were beginning to address this connection. Sometime after, I was participating on a Twitter chat hosted by Stanford University, and trauma came up again. So I leaned in and brought up my father's suicide when I was 8 years old. Well, that chat lit up like a Christmas tree, and I realized that they just needed a patient to get this much needed, much yearned for conversation started. Without pause, a pain psychologist strongly suggested that I do trauma release. When I asked what that meant, she answered with 4 letters, EMDR. While really excited that something could help me, I'd never heard of EMDR, and I certainly didn't know that it stood for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And yeah, that's still, even when reading it, it's still a mouthful. I immediately started talking with my women in pain friends, some who, to my surprise, were already doing EMDR with good results. But one trusted friend scared me when she cautioned that not only does one have to get a really good practitioner, but that the therapy could be very painful psychologically, as it could be triggering. So at that point, part of me was eager to try EMDR, the other, not so much. But once I was facing the big C and fighting for my life, once my very survival depended on me facing my trauma, learning about my trauma, and releasing my trauma, I was all in. Then and there, I started working with a great EMDR practitioner, and I picked up my first book about trauma, and to this day have not stopped reading. It never gets dull. Also, we began to focus the work at For Grace on the connection between trauma and illness. Okay, so now I want to tell you what I've learned. Part 2, my brain on trauma. 30 years ago, I walked into my first appointment with a pain psychologist. And one of the things I told her was that I had had a perfect childhood. And this is what many people who suffered great childhood trauma say. This happens because we're in denial. Remember, trauma likes to bed in our unconscious, and as such, we often cope by doing things like pushing down, even repressing memories that are too painful, or by only remembering the happy times, or maybe we don't want our experiences to reflect poorly on our families. In reality, for me, while there were a lot of good parts to my childhood, it was far from perfect. Besides my father's suicide, my family of origins traumas included substance abuse, domestic violence, mental illness, neglect, hunger, endless financial worries, and divorce. And the kicker is that the bad stuff started way before I was a child. In utero, I experienced what my mother experienced: constant stress, fear, terror. And it goes back further, as my ancestors on both sides were host to great trauma, including copious amounts of abandonment, denial, abuse, addiction, kidnapping, institutionalization, on and on, the generational trauma cycles. It's fair to say I was born behind the 8 ball. So as the generational, in utero, and childhood trauma piled up, my body and brain, which I like to call the body mind, got hit by a biological, physiological, and psychological tsunami. This flood of trauma wreaked havoc on my body mind, setting off a destructive cascade of events as I was in steady survival mode, doing what all of us with trauma do, trying to avoid annihilation. In short order, my brain developed incorrectly. Crucial neural connections were damaged, while certain parts grew too large and others too small. My nervous system was most often in fight or flight mode, and a near constant stream of toxic stress hormones were coursing through my veins, igniting body-wide inflammation. This set the stage for all of my illnesses to follow, and there were a lot of them. At age 12, I was hospitalized for and almost died from anorexia nervosa. At my worst, I was 5'8" and 79 pounds, literally a walking skeleton. Then at 18, dissociation set in the form of derealization. My world was so threatening at the time. My mind made everything around me look and sound unreal. When I was 21, complex regional pain syndrome lit my body and life on fire, ending my showbiz career and pretty much everything else. Shortly afterward, I was hit by generalized anxiety disorder causing debilitating panic attacks. What followed were many overlapping conditions, including fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. I thought I'd had my fair share, but at age 59, I got my worst diagnosis, the aforementioned cancer. Clearly, my body was saying no, but I didn't listen until I got a disease that was actively trying to kill me. That brings me back to trauma release. When I was doing EMDR, I learned that early on, every dysfunctional family chooses the most functional member and casts them in the role of the fixer and often the scapegoat as well. That was me, and it's probably you. Besides taking the brunt of the family blame, I did everything in my power to fix, to save my family. I did most of the cooking, cleaning, and worrying. I was the quintessential parentified child. I became a perfectionist and a pleaser. I never said no and excelled in school and all of the arts I pursued. But no one can save their family, least of all, a child. And she just kept on smiling. So I know that I had a lot of trauma in my childhood and that the trauma did a great deal of damage to my brain and body. The question is now, after nearly a lifetime of my body-mind being amped up, how did I come to a place of healing and peace? And how do I protect these precious resources? Part 3, the big unwind. I like this part. To find balance and regulation, to help heal my brain and body. There were many wonderful trauma release techniques that I did. some that I will continue for the rest of my life. The release techniques I did with a practitioner included talk therapy, and as I've touched on, EMDR, which was coupled with a therapy known as OEI, which stands for One Eye Integration, all of which had an amazing healing effect by releasing much of my trauma. As for trauma release techniques without a practitioner, I way upped my self-care game. Yes. That includes eating a delicious, anti-inflammatory, cancer-hostile diet. Besides fish, everything I eat is vegan. Also, I exercise for an hour, 6 days a week, swimming and doing ballet, Pilates, and Feldenkrais, as movement goes hand in hand with good health. For the first time in my life, I practice excellent sleep hygiene. For me, the most important part of this is getting in bed early and turning off all screens for wind down time. As a result, despite my fibromyalgia, I'm miraculously getting deep, restorative sleep on a regular basis for the first time since forever. Stress management has become my religion, and this includes many practices. First, I no longer work every moment of every day. Instead, I enjoy a balance between work and play. And play takes me to stress-busting places like singing, playing the piano, traveling, kitty cuddling. So cute. Socializing, reading, everything that sparks that awe and joy. Also, every day, I take about an hour for quiet time where I practice wonderfully calming rituals that I want to walk you through. I start with several deep breaths, then mentally list off things I'm grateful for. I then recite an affirmation out loud. The one I'm using now goes like this. My spirit is grounded deeply in the earth. I am calm, strong, centered, and peaceful. I am able to let go of fear and trust that I am eternally safe. I am worthy of all things beautiful. I then pray, though I'm more spiritual than religious, and I follow that with inner child work, remembering that the little Cynthia was the one who was most traumatized. We lovingly dialogue so that she can put her burden down and feel safe. I also dialogue with my ancestors, starting with my angel, Aunt Grace, who I name my work for, and who is a Cynthia in her family. This is called ancestral healing, and by healing their trauma, I get to heal my own. Next, I do a 20-minute guided mindfulness meditation where I often focus on self-healing and inner peace, and always bring my nervous system into rest and repair mode. Besides these rituals, but still in the framework of stress management, I have learned to say no. This is huge because remember, as a fixer, I always said yes. The problem with that is that when I say yes, but want to say no, that's a breeding ground for resentment and toxic stress, which, as we know, makes me sick. And speaking of toxic, what follows has been my Mount Everest of stress management. I have finally let go of toxic people in my life. This includes colleagues, friends, and yes, family members. In fact, before I fought cancer, with the exception of a couple of members, I chose to step away from my family for best chance at survival. And of particular interest, after going into remission for about a year and then letting those family members back in, within a month, I had a recurrence and had to fight for my life all over again. And that time, I almost didn't make it. After hitting remission a second time, I chose to let go of all of my toxic family members, this time for good. That was the best decision I have ever made for my health, and I've never looked back. The silver lining to that choice is that I'm now much closer to the healthy members of my family. Breathe. Besides cultivating these self-care gems, I've come to a new realization about disease and trauma that have brought me even more healing. I now see every disease not as an enemy, but as a friend, a teacher, in fact, who is there to share great wisdom. Every illness is a conversation I'm having with my body mind. The disease is there to tell me that I'm out of balance and to lovingly guide me back to wholeness. And then there's forgiveness, still a work in progress. I've come far to forgive myself and those who've trespassed against me. The gift is to myself, as forgiveness allows me to let go of unnecessary baggage that does not serve me and to move forward positively with my life. And that brings me to acceptance. I'm learning to accept what is in the moment and to just be with it, the good, the bad, the in between. With trauma, I've come to a deep understanding that there is no shame. It's not my fault that I've been plagued with trauma. And it's never helpful to blame those who've traumatized me. That doesn't mean that I don't hold them accountable, but blame comes from a place of unhealthy anger, which is illness provoking. Don't need it. I am deeply blessed to have reached post-traumatic growth, a process where I found a new appreciation for life, a newfound sense of personal strength, and a new focus on helping others. In the late 1990s, I found great satisfaction doing HMO reform advocacy because I'd been betrayed and harmed by my HMO. I became the center of protests, did media interviews, and spoke at press conferences, all in an effort to help others avoid my fate. Then in 2002, I expanded that work by founding For Grace, where I get the reward of helping others while being reminded daily that I'm a part of something much bigger than myself. That is amazing grace. You know, I've been thinking about writing a second memoir because I want to tell the full story. In Battle for Grace, published a decade ago, my introduction started with, and I quote, "This is a book about my life, a life that has been molded by pain." Well, we all know now that it should have read, "A life that has been molded by trauma." Seems I got a lot more to say. I wish you all good things on your trauma-informed journey, and I'm so glad that you're here. I respect and admire your courage and wisdom because we cannot find healing without going down this painful, taxing, yet ultimately nurturing and freeing road. Let's start now. I think we already have. Thank you all so much for listening. Stay brave. And I'll see you at lunch when John and I host our Q&A session. Till then, bye-bye, everyone.